What's up, everyone? Localization is an incredibly important part of a website, assuming you want to serve multiple countries with one website. Luckily, Payload CMS includes a way to enable localization across your collections and fields. Even better, Payload's localization works well with internationalization, and I'll cover each of these topics in detail in this video. If you want the code I use for this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. Before we just start adding the localization option to our existing fields, you should know that once you do this, the shape of your data changes. That means you may experience data loss. If you have an existing app with already existing fields, you'll want to ensure you have a field migration strategy in place to avoid any data loss. For me, this is an example project for educational purposes only, so it won't affect me too much. But still, I'll include a simple explanation about how you might migrate some data with MongoDB. With that out of the way, let's localize a couple of fields. We'll keep this simple by updating our pages config. So I'll come over here, go to our collections, go to our pages, and go to our config here. And in our pages config, we'll come down to our fields, and we have our slug and our title here, which are perfect for localization. So we can set localized to true for both of these. This is only the first step to enabling localization. Localization needs to be set at the config level to be fully enabled across your app. So we'll go to our payload config file and add the localization option. And we can just add it here since we're right there. We'll need to add our default locale, which for me will be English. For you, it may be something else. And then the locales that I want to support. Of course, that would be English and then Spanish as well. Now we can generate types. So we can do payload, generate types. Now, to ensure our data persists, we're going to run a migration to move our unlocalized data to the localized shape. So first we need to run payload migrate create, which if it doesn't exist, we'll create a migrations folder with an index.ts file in it. It'll also initialize your first migration. So let's open that migration file. And in it, we're only going to use the up function here. And while we're in this, we might as well handle a couple of translations along the way as well. So we have a constant called translations, which will be set equal to an object where we'll have our slug, where we can translate our home to inicio, about us, which we will translate as quienes somos, and then finally our portfolio page, which will be translated as portfolio. And then in this translations under slug, we will create another title object where we will translate home as, again, inicio, about us as quienes somos, and I'm being very careful as to add the accents, which will come back later. And then finally, portfolio, which will translate to portfolio with an uppercase P there. Then we can make a function called translate. So underneath our translations constant here, we're going to create a function called translate, which is going to take a page of type page from our payload types, our translations, which will be a record type, and that will have a string, as well as inside it, another record, which will have a string twice. So we expect this to resolve to just a record with a string and then an any type at the end. Now let's return that record. It'll have a slug in it, which will have our translations and our slug, and it'll take our page slug, which cannot be null, and if it is undefined, though, we will return our page slug. We'll do the same for title and just replace slug with title. I can just select all of these together and do title there. Now we can get all our pages and store them in a constant called pages. So we're going to await payload.find and look in our pages collection with no filters, return all of our pages by doing limit 0, and then we can process our results and pull out the resulting docs. After that, we need a for loop to process all of this. So we'll start with for and then constant page of pages, and we'll open up the for loop. And we're going to store the results from our translate function in a constant called translated and pass in the page we're processing and then the translations object from above. So we'll take our constant of translated and translate our page with translations object as the second argument. Then we are going to, for our locales, we're going to create another for loop with the constant of locale of this array, English or Spanish. And we're going to await payload update. And again, look in our collection pages. We're going to set our locale, which is going to have the type of typed locale, which I'll import automatically there. We'll have the ID of page ID, and then we'll need to pass in our data as well. We're going to bring in all of the page, but we're going to change the slug and check first if the locale is equal to Spanish. If it is, we'll return the translated slug, but if not, we'll return the page slug. And the same will be true for the title. So instead of slug, we'll check again the locale is Spanish, and then if it is, we'll return the translated title. Otherwise, we'll return the regular in English title. This script is done now, which means we can run it, generate our types, generate the import map just for good measure, and then start our development server. I'll do all of this in one command by just running p-npm payload migrate, a semicolon, payload generate types, semicolon, payload generate import map, and then finally p-npm dev. And so when I run this, we can see now that the development server is ready. So I can go to our local host 3000, and not much is going to change yet. First, because I am on the English side of my website, and then I haven't rendered anything with localization yet. But now that we have our localization enabled on a couple of our fields, let's go into more detail about the localization option in our payload config. We already set our default because that's a required field. What this does is it tells Payload and Next.js that if no locale is provided in a query, you would like this locale to be used. In our case, again, that's English. This way, locale is always defined. I'll leave this as EN for English, but you can change it to whatever language you would like to use by using the 2 or 4-letter code for the language. For example, I can use EN for English for my language code, but if I wanted to be more specific, I could use EN US. But I will keep it as just EN here. Below this, we do have our locales option, which again is required, and you can do more than just provide an array of locales. You can use object notation to add more details to each locale you would like to support. If you open up an object in the locales array, code and label become required. Again, you can use any 2 or 4-letter language code for the languages you want to support. Let's change our locales array to support objects. So I'm just going to get rid of this array and open a new one and start with one object, which will have the code of EN with the label of English. After this, I can add another locale, and I'll again use Spanish. And for the label, I will use Spanish with Spanish translated from English into the actual translated language. Since this is not my default language, I can set my default English language as the fallback by using fallback locale as English. If we supported a third language that I would prefer this fallback to before going back to the default, I could set this to something else. You are also able to explicitly set a fallback locale in your query on the front end. You also have the option to change the direction of the text of languages that read from right to left. Think things like Arabic and Hebrew. Spanish and English don't read from right to left though, so I can leave this as false, which is the default value. Fallback is a Boolean value that enables the functionality that allows a document to return a value for a field that may not have a value in a specific locale. For example, if I don't have a title defined for my Spanish locale, but I do for English, then my Spanish locale will take the value of my English title. Fallback is true by default, but if you don't want this behavior, you can set it to false. This will make the field undefined, so you should provide a fallback on the front end. You can choose if you want your publish button to publish to all locales by default or only the local locale. The option you don't select will be available in the secondary button attached to the publish button. And you do this with default locale publish option. And here I'm going to set it to active instead of all. The last option available to you is the filter available locales option. This allows you to use an async function that takes rec and locales as arguments to filter out what locales you would like to display in your admin UI. For example, I'll set our filter available locales to accept a function that will have our rec object as well as our locales with rec and locales as arguments. And in this, we'll return our locales and filter out the locales that are not equal to English. Obviously, I want my English locale, so I'll comment out this code to keep it in my admin UI. A common use case for this is a multi-tenant application where one tenant may support more or less languages than another. You'd be able to fetch that tenant environment you're in and then return the correct locales for that tenant. Let's move on to update a few more back-end things that will be affected by this change. The first one is our search plugin. In our search plugin configuration, we'll need to change our localize option to true, which will automatically localize our title for us. Remember, this is the default value, so you could just remove this option. So if we go down to our search plugin, we can see localize is set to false. I'll set it to true. And we'll also want to set our slug option down here to be localized. So I can set localized to true here as well. The second update we need to make is to our live preview. So still in our payload config, we're going to find our live preview, and we need to add our locale to the URL option here, and finally add it here as well to create our new URL shape. Now that our backend is all set up, we need to make a few adjustments to our front end so we can fully implement localization. The first is setting up our routing. We'll need to create a locale dynamic segment and then add all of our front end files to it. So we'll do that by adding to our app a new directory called locale in square brackets, which makes it a dynamic segment. And then we're going to take all of our front end files and move it into our locale dynamic segment. I can refactor that and then open up our locale directory. We're not enabling localization to my posts collection or my auth routes, but with how we set this up later in the video, that will make it all irrelevant. We'll make sure we handle a default case for our localization to ensure any of our collections and routes without localization enabled will still be accessible. Everything should now go through our locale dynamic segment. So now, before getting our pages set up to accept localization, the next step is to make sure we have redirects in place and some translations included for what we're trying to do. But before we start talking about and setting up internationalization, check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel so you never miss when I release more content about Payload CMS, Tailwind CSS, Next.js, and other modern web dev technology. Tired of trying to keep up with all the news and updates across the technologies and companies you use? Sign up for my newsletter to get a bi-weekly overview of all the web dev news from across the internet. The link to that is in the description. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to it. Internationalization is a natural companion to localization. We'll be using next-intl by installing this package with npm add next-intl, and I can run that. There are a few files we need to set up in order to use this package correctly. Let's create a new directory in our app folder using the shorthand for internationalization, which is i18n. This will also have a directory inside of it called messages, and we'll also add a new file called localization.ts, a request.ts, and finally a routing.ts. The request.ts and routing.ts files are required for the package to work, and the localization file is there just to make our lives easier. So let's start there. All I'm going to do in the localization.ts file is create a constant called localization, and then back in our payload config, I'm going to copy our localization config and paste it here in the constant. I can remove the commented out code, and now I can export our default localization. And now what I can do is replace the localization object here with that constant we just created as our localization config. Next up will be our routing.ts file. This is essentially a config file for our internationalization process and will tell the next-intl package how to behave around Next.js navigation APIs. We'll first import define routing from next-intl routing and create navigation from the same package but from navigation, and our localization object that we just created as well. Then we need to export a constant called routing that will have the function define routing, which takes our locales, which we can get from our localization object by mapping our locale and pulling out the locale code, as well as the default locale, which we'll just get from our localization object right there from default locale. We can then export a destructured constant from our create navigation hook with the routing argument passed in, and we're going to pull out our link, redirect, use path name, and use router. Lastly, we can export a type called locale, which is going to be set equal to a type of routing.locales as an array. Now we can move to our messages directory, where we'll add a JSON file for each language we anticipate supporting. For me, that's English and Spanish, so I'll have an en.json and then an es.json file. Now I'll just copy and paste some common language that we might use here. So for our Spanish, which is the open file, we can pass in this object. And then for the English object, we can pass in the same thing, but in English. We'll round out our internationalization directory with the request.ts file, which will handle the requests for our middleware using the configurations we've set up. First, we need to come to our request.ts file, and we're going to import from next-intl server our get request config, and then we're going to import routing from our routing file, and then finally English from our messages en.json file. And let's make sure we get our English file there. We'll define our type of messages to be type of the English object from our JSON file. And we're going to declare a new global to use interface intl for international messages. And this is going to extend our messages object. And then we can type in export default get request config. And we're going to pass in a callback function. And here we're going to have our request locale. This will typically correspond to the locale segment we created. Now we can create a let variable called locale and await our request locale. We'll want to ensure that a valid locale is used by checking if that locale exists. So we can type in if locale is false, or if routing.locales includes locale as any. And if that is true, we can get our locale from our routing default locale. And this means that if I put in any other 2-digit country code in place of EN or ES, it will redirect me automatically to my English locale. Then we can return an object that contains the locale, as well as the messages, which we can await our import of messages locale JSON default. Now we can set up a middleware.ts file that will handle all of this for us. This config comes directly from the Next Internationalization documentation, but I'll explain it in brief as I type it out. First, let's create a TypeScript file called middleware.ts in our source directory. So we will type in middleware.ts. Now in our middleware.ts, we're going to import create middleware from next-intl middleware. And we're going to import routing from our internationalization routing file, and we're going to export a constant called config that will match all the path names except for the ones that start with admin, API, TRPC, next, Vercel, as well as any that contain a dot like your favicon or other image files. And so we can type in matcher and then a regular expression which covers all of those files and path names that I mentioned. This prevents our backend routes from being lumped into this so our APIs don't get internationalized as well. Even though this will redirect our login and dashboard pages, everything will work as configured since we have a default locale set. This sets us up nicely to slowly roll out localization across our app. Before we load up our front end to test some of this functionality, we'll need to set up a provider in our layout.tsx that allows us to use our locale as well as our translations we set up in our messages. I know we'll want a translated not found page as well, so let's start there. You're able to provide a notfound.tsx file to replace the default one provided by next.js. Since we're internationalizing our content, we should create one of these that can translate the content for our Spanish audience. I already set up the translation keys I need in the messages directory from earlier, so let's create a notfound.tsx file in our locale dynamic segment. So now we'll go to our app, locale, and then add a new file called notfound.tsx. And first, we're going to import our link from next-link. We're going to import React from React. We'll import use translations from next-internationalization. And then we're going to export a default function called notfound. And we're going to initialize our use translations hook in the constant t. You can only use the use translations hook in synchronous functions. This is a general limitation of hooks, not the next internationalization package. Translations done in async functions will need to be done a different way. Now we can return the content of our page. So we will return a div, and inside this div, we'll have another div. And inside this div, we'll have an h1, which will just say 404. And then we're going to include a paragraph, which will have a t, and then open parentheses, and we will set the key to page not found. Lastly, we're going to include our link component here, which is going to have our translation for go home, which means that this should be the home route. Let's add some styles. At the top here, we have our container div. So we'll have the class name of container with a padding top and bottom of 28, mx, auto, so margin left and right, auto, and text center. Internally, this div will have a max width of none. The 404 will have a class name of margin bottom of 0. Our paragraph tag will have a class name of margin bottom 4. And then lastly, our link will have a class name of BG Emerald 950, text Emerald 50, padding left and right of 1 rem, padding top and bottom of half a rem, and that's it here. We still have a few more things we can do before we can preview our front end, so we'll see this in action shortly. Next, we need to set up our layout.tsx file, which wraps our entire front end. We'll add a provider which will enable translations site-wide, and will also ensure our localization is handled correctly at the root level. So we can go over to our layout.tsx file that is included in our front end directory. And here I see layout. We'll start by importing a few things. So at the top here, we'll import our next-internationalized client provider from next-internationalization. We're going to import localization from our internationalization directory. We're going to import routing from the same place. We'll import the not found function from next navigation, and this will push people to our new not found page. Then we'll import our typed locale from payload, as well as our get messages and our set request locale from next internationalization server. First things first, we need to make sure that this is an async function and that we get our params into our root layout, which means we need to add our params to the type here, which is going to expect a promise of our typed locale. We can then destructure our locale from our awaited params, and then we'll use a constant called current locale to store our current locale, which we'll get by going into our localization object. So first we'll start with constant current locale, go into our localization object, and find in our locales the location we're looking for. So in this case, we'll check that our location code is equal to our locale. If you need to set the direction of text, you can do that with the following code. We don't need to do this since both Spanish and English read left to right, but we can check our current locale. If our current locale has the RTL option, we can then return RTL, otherwise it can stay LTR. We can then check if the locales array in the routing config includes the locale from our params. So we need an if statement to do this, and we can check if not, routing locales includes locale as any. We can push our not found page, and this will redirect anyone using an unsupported locale to our not found page. We can then set our request locale to locale and then store our messages by awaiting get messages and putting it in our constant message. We'll change our language equals en to be our locale instead. Then we can add the dir attribute and set it to direction. And then within the body tag, we need to add above the children prop here, our next internationalization client provider with our messages being provided there. And then we can bring our toaster and children into that component. Then if you want to include these as static pages, we can export a function called generate static params, which will take no arguments, and then we'll return our routing locales array and map through those and returning our locale. The last step we need to do to enable all of this across our app is to update our next config file. So we'll go over to our next.config.mjs, and in here we're going to import our create next international plugin from next internationalization plugin. And then underneath this, we'll create a new constant called with next internationalization and set that equal to create next internationalization plugin. We can then wrap with payload with our with next internationalization constant here. So now we can spin up our development server, and you can see I got an error. And this is because I did not put our internationalization directory in the right place. So now, by default, the internationalization directory needs to be included in the source directory. I did not do that. So I can move the internationalization directory to my source directory and refactor. And now I should be able to spin up my development server, and I can see that it's ready and good to go. And so another thing that I need to fix is that I moved all of my front-end route group into my locale. And so what this is doing is, while it does work, it's messing with my styles. So what I can do is take front-end back out of locale and add locale to the front-end route group, and then move all of my front-end content into the locale dynamic segment. And once that's done, I can refresh, and I'm able to see that my styles apply. Now, you may be thinking, didn't we migrate and translate all of these slugs and titles already? So why isn't this showing up as a rendered page? Well, that's because we haven't set up our front-end pages to take localization quite yet. We'll get there, but first, let's finish up our search component. So we're going to add a few translations to our search component, not our search route, our search component. So we're going to come down to our components and find our search component. And we're going to import our use translations hook from next internationalization. And under debounced value, we can initialize our use translations hook and in our use effect where we're pushing our debounced value to the search route. And now here we could put our locale where we're pushing to our search route here, but that's not necessary since we have set up our middleware. Even though our search label is hidden, we should still translate it for screen readers. So we're going to call our use translations hook for our search key. We're going to do the same thing here. Instead of search, we'll have our translations and we'll call search. And then for our button type, again, this is hidden, but for screen readers, we'll want to get our submit key from our translations. Now, we actually didn't set up our submit key in our translations, so we can go over to our English JSON, which we can pass in submit, because we do need to translate for both. So we have our submit key there. So we'll add submit here, which will be in VR. Now we can update the server component part of the search process. We can't use the use translations hook over there, so we'll do a couple of translations as we go. Over in our locale search route, we'll open up our page and we're going to get our typed locale from payload. Then we're going to add to our args, our params, which will be a promise of locale, which will expect a typed locale. We can then add our params to our function arguments, and then we'll destructure below our payload a constant called locale, which will await those params. We can pass in the locale here in our query. And then in our H1, we can check if locale is equal to English. We can pass in search. Otherwise, we can use buscar as our Spanish translation. Now here, we don't have posts enabled for localization, so I want to filter out all of the posts from our Spanish results. I can do that using the filter method. So I'm going to add filter, and we're going to look through our docs, and we're going to check first that our locale is equal to Spanish. If it is, we will return true when doc.doc relation to is equal to pages. Otherwise, we'll return true. And now I need to add the locale to our slug constant here, and I can add it to the end of the home route. So I can add locale there. And then as well as for pages, by adding it here before the doc slug. Now I don't need it for posts, again, because that is not enabled for localization. I also want to update a few classes in my link. We'll add grow, shrink, basis 0, and min width of 0. This allows each link to take up all available space while still wrapping and then taking up 100% of the space if it wraps. Then if we have no results, we will first check that locale is equal to English. If it is, we can return our English no results found. Otherwise, we can return that in Spanish there. And so now if I load up our search, we can see that we have our translations here for buscar, and then I can see all of the pages that have localization enabled and are already translated. If we go to the English version, I can see all of our pages here, and we will troubleshoot why we're getting our titles here in Spanish instead of in English. The last thing we need to do is add localization to the pages so we return the proper content for our pages. So we will go to our locale slug page.tsx. We're going to get our typed locale from payload. We then need to add to our params in our arguments our locale, which will be optional and will expect the typed locale. And in our destructured params promise here, we can pull out our locale and set it equal to English for the default. And we need help setting our default slug depending on our locale. So we can create a constant called locale slugs, set it equal to an object where we have our English version home and our Spanish version inicio. And I can pass in, instead of this set equal to home, I can set it equal to our locale slugs and pass in our locale to get what our default slug is. We'll then need to add our locale to the query. And then since Spanish has accented characters that we use, we can use the decode URI component to make sure that our slug doesn't ignore those accents and those accents don't mess up our query. Now, if I save this, we can check our functionality by first going to our home page, which loads up no problem. We see the home H1 there, but if I go to ES, I now see Inicio. I can then look at Portfolio, which I can now see translates to Portfolio, and I can change this back to English and do our portfolio. And so we see that working just fine. One last thing that we need to take care of is in our search route, we can see that our home page, our About Us page, and our portfolio page all have a Spanish translated title. And that's because we need to re-index our search plugin. So we can go to our search results, and we can set our locale to English, and we can re-index our pages. I hit confirm. And now I can see that our title, home, about us, and portfolio are updated. And if I switch over to Spanish, I can see that those translate as well. Now, if I refresh, our titles are all exactly as they should be. And the last thing to check is to make sure that something like en portfolio doesn't work. And here I can see that I get my 404 because there is no portfolio slug in our English locale. And there's so much more you can do with localization, including enabling it across all of your apps and fields and adding translated content to each collection. If you serve multiple audiences across several languages, this is just one way to serve their needs in their native language. I will say that adding localization to an existing project isn't too difficult, but you'll have a much easier time if you're starting from scratch with a set localization strategy in place. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content about Payload CMS, Next.js, Tailwind CSS, and more. Also, consider subscribing to my newsletter to stay up to date with modern web dev news from across multiple platforms. There's a link for that in the description. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.